Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on reflections from former international students, important considerations from our profession and training programs, which is hosted collaboratively by the student and webinar committees of the American Psychological Association's Division 52 for International Psychology, the international section of APA's Division 17, Society for Counseling Psychology, and Division 15, the student division of the International Association of Applied Psychology, IAAP. We appreciate you being here with us for this important conversation. My name is Daniel Balva, and I'll be serving as one of the co-chairs of this webinar alongside Dr. Satyabhanu Jivamba and Nayan Yang from Division 17 and Marika Dacheva from IAAP's Division 15 in collaboration with the Division 52 webinar committee chairs Dr. Pina Marsico and Dr. Luca Tateo, and fellow webinar committee members, Dr. Falu Rami, Dr. Karen Brown, and Dr. Mary Bullock. Given that this webinar is a collaborative effort, we would like to introduce our wonderful collaborators, first beginning with Dr. Banu from the international section of APA's Division 17.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say it's so exciting that to be a part of this webinar collaborating. I love collaborating with folks from different spaces, and being invited by Division 52 by Daniel to do this was awesome. And so I am one of the outgoing student reps, as I'm no longer a student anymore, graduating this past summer. And, you know, having served with Division 17's international section as a student rep for the last couple of years was wonderful. And I actually have a colleague and good friend, Nayan Yang, but she can't be here to join us today. So, you know, what we've done is really we've worked with our student members very closely in advocating for their needs, coming up with programming and events that they have said that they have interest in. And so I do know that we will be putting out a call for applications for new student reps to join us. So should anyone who's here be interested, please look out for those in the listservs. I know it was a wonderful opportunity and I learned so much. I got to meet so many wonderful folks. And I'm looking forward to what the panelists will be talking about today. This is something that we've decided would be a wonderful topic, and a lot of folks have said that they want to hear a lot of different perspectives here. So yeah, I will be sharing a link here to our sections division and information you can all look over and reach out should you have any questions or interest. But I'm so excited for what we have today. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banu, and thanks to you, of course, to Nayan as well, who we're definitely missing today, but we appreciate all of her collaboration as well, and to Division 17's international section for collaborating with us. And we'd also like to introduce our other wonderful collaborator, Marika Dacheva from Division 15 of the International Association of Applied Psychology.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, APA, for inviting IAP to co-host this event. I'm so excited to be part of this event and to represent the Division 15, which is the Students Division of the International Association of Applied Psychology, IAP, which is actually the oldest association of applied psychology in the world. We have 18 divisions, each focusing on a specific area of psychology, such as work, clinical, health, sports psychology, and so on. So we definitely have a little bit of something for every psychologist out there and every psychology student. Well, in particular, our Division 15 brings together students from all educational levels, undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate students. And we aim to link students with researchers and practitioners and to promote applied psychology all around the world. We are offering various activities and projects for professional development of students. For instance, this year we organized our very first early career marathon event, which was a 24 hours online event of applied psychology research, where early career researchers as well as students presented their work, and we also awarded the best presenters for their research achievements. We also aim to, of course, strengthen the international network of psychology students. Hence, we're really grateful and proud to collaborate with APA on this event and, of course, on other future collaborations that I'm sure will come very soon. So I'm really excited to get this event started. And if you would like to learn more about IAP activities, we will also provide you with a link in the chat where you can visit our website and Division 15. So you can get to know a little bit more about the activities we do for international students to promote applied psychology. Thank you all so much.
And thank you so much to Marika and to Division 15 of the International Association of Applied Psychology for being such an important collaborator today as well.
All right, so before we begin here today, I thought it would be helpful for us to go over some of the logistics on how to use the Q&A feature. It's really neat that Zoom has that. So if you all, for the participants who are listening in and watching, please feel free to type in your questions throughout the webinar today. And you'll be able to pose your question if you have someone specifically you're thinking of, or if it's generally for the panelists, you can indicate that in the Q&A box. And it will be on the bottom left of your screen, I believe. It'll say Q&A. So, throughout, just use that. You can also use the chat box function if you just want to, connect with people and have something in response you want to see and share, be as interactive as you would like. Please do so. And then we'll have, towards the end of the webinar, we have a portion for question and answers that we will then pull from the Q&A and ask our panelists. So yeah, we can get started at this time. We are super honored to introduce and welcome our wonderful panelists, and I'll let Daniel get started with that.
Thank you. And as we go ahead and introduce our panelists, we'd also love to know where everyone is coming from. So for those in attendance today, please feel free to write in the chat box and introduce yourselves and let us know where you're joining from. And first and foremost, of course, with our panelists, I'd like to welcome Dr. Richa Khanna, who is a counseling psychologist and an assistant professor in the School of Human Ecology at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, India, since 2019, where she has been teaching, mentoring, and supervising master's applied psychology students. She was raised in Mumbai, but eventually went on to complete her educational milestones in different cities within India and also overseas. She obtained her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Fergusson College, Pune in 2007. She completed her Master's of Arts degree in industrial psychology from SNDT Women's University, Mumbai in 2009. Post-graduation, Dr. Khanna worked as a psychologist in Mumbai for 2.5 years, during which time she gained experience in behavioral training of corporate clients and career counseling of students and young adults. She completed her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, United States in 2018, and a postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Delaware Center for Counseling and Student Development in 2019, specializing in topics pertaining to social justice. Dr. Khanna has extensive cross-cultural clinical experience, having provided mental health services to clients in both India and the United States. She's especially passionate about mental health outreach, gender-based and multicultural feminist work, student wellness, workplace mental health, international and cross-cultural psychology and training, supervising and mentoring students of psychology. Dr. Khanna, it's a pleasure to have you joining us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Daniel. It's lovely being here.
And yes, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Khanna. And I have the honor to also introduce our next panelist today, and this is Dr. Sonia Dhallwal. Dr. Sonia Dhallwal is a licensed psychologist and the director of training of the APA accredited internship side of counseling and psychological services at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She received her graduate training at the School of Professional Psychology, Pacific University in Oregon. She then completed her APA accredited clinical internship at Michigan State University, followed by her postdoctoral training at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She was recently elected to serve a 2-year term as a board member for the Association of Counseling Center Training Agencies, also known as ACTA. Dr. Dhallwal was trained as an emotion-focused therapist, and her clinical interests lie in working with complex trauma within non-majority populations and running substance use and eating disorder groups. She's passionate about issues pertaining to the experience of clinical supervision and mentorship in non-majority graduate students. Dr. Dhallwal, thank you so much for joining us today, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to share with our participants today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia. And I also have the pleasure today to introduce Dr. Choi. He's a professor and the Dean of School of Psychology at Korea University. Ki-hong obtained his PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he completed his clinical internship at the University of Rochester Medical Center and postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University Medical Center. Before joining the faculty at Korea University, he worked as an associate research scientist at Yale University School of Medicine. He has worked with people with severe mental illness to develop evidence-based assessment tools and psychosocial interventions. Recently, he has been actively participating in the legislation process for psychologists in South Korea as a Secretary of External Affairs of the Korean Psychological Association. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Ki-hong.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm also very much excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, I have the honor of also introducing Dr. Ayna, who is a clinical psychologist and faculty at the Department of Psychiatry in the American University of Beirut Medical Center, adjunct faculty at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at Emory University School of Medicine, and a consultant for mental health programming at United Palestinian Appeal in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ayna studied at the American University of Beirut, received a Master's of Science in Addictive Behaviors from the University of Liverpool in England, a PhD in Clinical Psychology from Wayne State University, and completed a postdoctoral residency in Health Service Psychology at Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Dina is currently licensed to practice in the state of Georgia and in Lebanon, and specializes in the treatment of severe emotion dysregulation, trauma, and supporting frontliners in times of crises. She started the first DBT consult team and ACT skills group in Lebanon. Dr. Dina is also active in community service. In 2017, she received the Richard W. Morrill Community Commitment Award by the Psychology Division at Emory University. In 2019, she was appointed a co-chair for Division 52 for International Psychology, programming at the APA Convention by Division President Dr. Brigitte Coury, and received a presidential citation for her dedicated service. More recently, at the AUBMC, Dr. Dina spearheaded mental health support for staff responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and other crises in Lebanon. Dr. Dina, we're honored to have you here with us as well today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. And of course, we're most grateful to each and every one of our panelists for taking the time across so many different time zones to be here with us during this event. And we're most excited to go ahead and proceed with our questions for our panelists. And so how we'll do this is, of course, during the webinar, for those who have questions, attendees, please feel free to write those in the question and answer box, and also feel free if you'd like in the chat box, and we'll get to those during the latter portion of this event. And in terms of the questions that we'll start with, we'll address each question to a specific panelist, and then we'll open up the floor in case any other panelists might also like to respond. So everyone, please feel free to share your thoughts as well if you'd like. And so to begin, Dr. Khanna, we'll start with you if that's okay. And can you please tell us a little bit about your decision to pursue an international education and what that process was like for you? So in terms of the decision to pursue an education outside of your home country, the decision of a specific training program and an advisor, and any other considerations that you might have taken as well.
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Daniel, for that. So thank you for that introduction and kind of giving the attendees an idea of my background, so I don't have to go too much into that. But so the decision to pursue higher education was made around 10 years back when I had just completed my master's in industrial psychology, and I was working, like you said, for around 2.5 years. And I just remember feeling just really frustrated with the lack of sensitivity to mental health concerns here in India and the systems here, because I clearly remember a time when, I went to a particular client trying to, in a sense, sell mental health to them. And they very kind of casually said, well, we don't need it. There's no one crazy here. So, I'm not really sure how we can use your services, which just again told me the level of stigma that was there. The other thing was, I had this kind of belief that there is a right way to learn psychology, and I felt like if most of the books and the theories we're learning are from the West, then that's where I need to go and learn psychology the way that that's the way to learn it, and that those are the beliefs I held at the time. So that all these kind of psychological processes led me to trying to understand, okay, let's really see what's out there. And I started with looking at master's programs in the US predominantly, primarily because I have support systems there, I have some family there, so that was my kind of first go-to. But due to issues of lack of funding, because as we know, or I'm not sure if people know, but master's programs are not very easily funded, and even though they are short, they can be quite a financial strain for someone who is coming in internationally, and I'm sure even for people living domestically, but particularly for those living internationally or trying to pursue that. So I actually did get into a master's program back then, but I decided not to continue because there was not a short funding. And so the PhD felt a little more appealing at that time. And even though it would take much longer for me to complete, it just felt like a more financially, better investment of my time as well as money. And I was very privileged in a sense that my family was able to support me and, for me to live there. And I mean, I also had to work, and, I worked as a graduate assistant, but overall, I think it felt like I wanted more opportunity. I wanted more growth. But I will say that I knew I was taking a risk because I didn't know, and I'm talking 10 years back when things were very different in terms of psychology here in India. I think mental health has really grown as a field here now that I've come back and seen how things are. But I was essentially very desperate to leave the country and get a better education. Like I said, thanks to that level of frustration. So I went in not knowing what to expect. I was following my heart. And I will say this, that something that I considered much later is this came up in a conversation with my family as well, that I'm happy to disclose. I was 26 when I left India to pursue the 6-year PhD. And things that I didn't consider at the time was, the fact that I will essentially be differentiating myself from peers who are here and who are, essentially set up and living in, independently. They're fairly settled in their life. And now that I've come back, I feel like I'm kind of starting from scratch. So, I mean, it felt that way at least 2 years back. Now I'm feeling much better about it, but I didn't consider that and how that would, again, affect my sense of self and, who I am and my identity and things like that. So that was broadly kind of my process. And just to add real quick, in terms of choosing programs, I was particular about looking at APA accredited programs. And my research interests at the time were primarily focused on positive psychology and spirituality. So I went ahead looking for advisors in that area. And, again, in retrospect, I didn't consider much in terms of, weather, location, transportation, and things like that, which was a harsh reality when I landed in the US. But until then, I was just, like I said, just very happy to leave India and have a new experience. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanna. I mean, it seems like there were so many important considerations beforehand, and then even when coming to the US, it seems like there were so many new considerations as well, that maybe hadn't been thought of previously. But I'm really grateful for you sharing your story and definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. It was an interesting process.
Thank you. And I wonder if any of our other panelists might like to share as well.
Yeah, let me share my experience a little bit. When I was in undergraduate program, I was interested in psychiatric rehabilitation. So I had some volunteer experiences at the community mental health center. And during my master's program, I was able to doing some clinical work at the community mental health center as a research team member to develop a social cognitive intervention for people with schizophrenia and other serious mental disorders. And at the time, I experienced that the psychiatric rehabilitation paradigm and services in South Korea were mainly medical model basis. And I was very much curious how psychological services, such as cognitive behavior therapy or cognitive rehabilitation, can be best delivered by licensed psychologists to our clients. So I was searching for a more integrated model and biopsychosocial model based psychological services. And so decided wanted to have training from multidisciplinary treatment team and evidence-based psychological services, something like that. So I searched for the PhD programs specialized in severe mental disorders and psychiatric rehabilitation in the United States. And so that's why I applied to those programs. And I found that the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, actually, I didn't know where the Nebraska is. And that was my first time to get into the United States for the first time in my life. I never been to here. So, but I found that the training program and the mentor was great, and they have very good training program there, especially for severe mental disorder. So yeah, I found that their training program research has a great fit with my interest, and so I finally decided to come here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. He, for sharing as well.
Yeah, as I'm hearing just even Dr. Khanna and Dr. Choi talk about the experiences, it seems like it was very much like going to a new place, like taking a chance, and also then the fit of like trying to find a good fit of like what your interest was and the program that you were going into. It makes me think of just myself and my stories that I'm sure a lot of people here who are watching in and hearing might also resonate with so much of what we both shared. I have the next question here, and this is for Dr. Dhallwal. If we could start with you, we're wondering, what was your experience like pursuing an international education here in the U.S., and how, if at all, were you able to find like support from, if it was from programs or advisors, if it was peers or any other sort of group of people or organization?
Yeah, such a good question. So I started my journey in the United States when I was 18, 19. So I came in as an undergrad from Malaysia and started at the University of Hawaii, and then transitioned over to Oregon for my graduate work. I think, and this was a while ago, so 2001, when there really weren't a whole lot of opportunities to maybe pursue a student exchange program. There were a few American universities that were represented at the college I was at, so I had some knowledge about studying abroad, and I remember I had an academic advisor who I would go to every week because I had a bunch of questions about like, what is it like to live in the US and how would this work and how do I apply for a visa and all of that. So I had some support there. And I think at the time, things were just set up differently. I think now that there are more resources and studying abroad is not such a maybe novel idea, like more people are doing it. So I think, you know, that advisor was helpful. I had some input from a couple of professors I was working with, which was helpful. They had done their graduate work in the US as well. And then I think it was just also like reaching out like on my own to folks who were international students at the University of Hawaii in preparation for coming over. So I did a lot of that legwork, I think, on my own. And, you know, I will say that, and I know this kind of maybe bleeds into the next question a little bit, but, you know, I think funding is such a huge issue for international students because you know, we're not always eligible for loans. And so a lot of the times, like we, you know, our families support us. We're not really allowed to work in the US as international students. So that financial piece, I think, is a huge decision factor as well. And so I had applied for a couple of scholarships. And honestly, that was how I was able to come over in the first place. So I think in moving forward, and I always think about this, like how can we better support international students in that way? And, you know, are there scholarships we could offer or funding opportunities? And even when you think about graduate school, it's very limiting, right? I mean, there are graduate assistantships and there are teaching assistantships, but really not enough to maybe cover a lot of the costs that you endure as an international student. So I think that was definitely, you know, something that I was always very mindful of. And, you know, and I think as most international students know, like when you first come over to the US, you're always converting. So I'm like, how much is that like in ringgits? Like, how much is that back home? And like, just such a different perspective of finance and financial decision making and all of that. But let me not digress too much. I mean, I think overall it was wonderful. I am really grateful for the experiences that I had as an undergraduate student and a graduate student. And I found that once I came here to the US, there were just so many more opportunities to get mentorship that I appreciated that maybe I didn't have at home at the time. And like I said, I think that's definitely changing back home, because when I talk to folks back home, I mean, this was like, you know, 20 years ago now that I've been here, and now there's so much more support, I think, for psychology and the profession and all of that. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but overall very positive. And I think we're moving in a better direction to support international students in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Dhallwal. Like even just that piece about how funding and the scholarship stuff is like so limited. And I mean, the number of times, you know, I think I've experienced that when I was an international student here, or even had folks, other peers and like, you know, people I know just saying like, what can they do? How can they sustain to continue to stay? And that's definitely been such an issue. And I know, like, depending on the political climate and things like that, that can also impact the kind of resources that are out there and available. But yeah, it's nice to know just kind of your experience with it and how you made this connection. It sounds like advisors, professors, and you had to do a lot of that yourself, like connecting to other international student communities at the school that you were going to go to. Yeah, that's such a thing that I think is helpful when you don't know really where to start. So thank you for sharing that piece. Yeah, does anyone else on the panelists have anything they want to add about their experience and how they pursued international education and how they found support?
I share the financial stability is very important for the international students, and also the legal status is also kind of important. So I had a F1 student visa when I went to the United States as an international student. And then when I applied for the internship, actually I have to change mine to, I have to use the OPT visa. It's a kind of in between kind of visa, kind of translating, people transferring to the H1 or something like that, other kind of working visa. So that was a little bit kind of tricky at that time because my university had not much international clinical students there. So they had little experience with that. So was very kind of important to me. And then actually find out they address that optimally. There was also legal status was important. And during my doctoral program, actually the funding was secured, but when I find out the internship program and then postdoc to stay here, the funding was very, very important. But the majority of training, NIH training funding only available for, I think, people with citizenship or green card or permanent residency, not for the international students, so scholars. So I have to find out the mentors or advisors who have another kind of NIH funding, not training funding or private kind of funding. So luckily, I have good friends to help me to find out resources and the advisors who seeking for the hiring the postdoctoral students of scholars. So, but during the time, I was real kind of stressed out. So how can I find out the job with my wife and my family? And so that was kind of important for me at the time, I remember.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Choi, for sharing that piece, the legal aspect of things too, and how you had maybe turned to like advisors and mentors and friends as well. I'm seeing here on the chat that folks are really relating to the trickiness, I think, of funding and the challenge for finance. And I'm wondering if the panelists, if you're looking on the chat, people are really resonating what you're sharing. Yeah, and I maybe saw that Dr. Dina, Dr. Khanna had your hands up. Maybe you had a response, and I just want to check in if you want to still share.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
My internet connection is very unstable. So
yes, Dr. Now you're cutting.
So my experience was a little bit different. I really didn't have much of a clue at that time. Yes, I apologize. My internet connection is really bad. Okay. Maybe I'll try to see if I can change into a different hotspot.
Okay, sounds good. We can maybe circle back to you. Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Khanna, would you like to share?
Yeah, thanks, Banu. And I completely resonate with the the funding challenges and having to, when you're an international student, you're not allowed to work more than 20 hours a week. As far as I remember, I believe that still holds unless something has drastically changed, but I don't think so. And you're only allowed to work on campus, again, from what I recollect. So again, those opportunities are very limited, which I think also carries forward to that question around like recommendations for training programs and people in senior leadership positions who have the power to make these changes or to be a little more sensitive to these concerns. I want to speak also a little bit to the social factor that sometimes, is hard to notice until it kind of starts having an impact on you, emotionally. And I think the aspect of leaving, again, a life behind on a personal level, having to, in a sense, restart your social life and try to find people that you can resonate with, you can connect with, I think is highly kind of, again, needs a little more attention. Those support systems. You're trying to maintain past friendships, but that's not always easy given like time zone differences, and people change, they move on. You've left the country, so they're not that friendship. It looks a little different. So, and that can take a toll on students' mental health when when they're trying to find local support, but they're also living maybe in their home country, like mentally and psychologically speaking. So that navigation can also be hard. And again, for me, all this comes into awareness retrospectively. I did not think of it as much when I went there, given again, I want to say I was fairly naive when I left the country, not knowing, like I said, what to expect. Not even knowing what job I'm going to have after 6 years. Who's going to hire a counseling psychologist in India if that's what I want to do. So all this is easier to say now, given that I've had a chance to reflect and look back. So I just want to name those things too.
Yeah, thank you so much for naming that piece, that ever-changing like social connection thing. Leaving, going to the US, and then if you want to move back, having to re-establish that. Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, because folks are thinking about maybe shifting where they are, then can maybe have that as a thought to reflect on too. Yeah. Dr. Dina, I see your back, so please go ahead.
Yes, hopefully this is better. I borrowed someone else's phone, new hotspot, so fingers crossed. My experience was a little bit different, as I had no idea what clinical psychology actually entailed. So I knew that I wanted to help people. I knew that I wanted to listen to people's problems and then try to help them somehow. But I didn't know the difference between the different therapies or the different areas. I had no idea psychology was this vast, diverse field. So when I came to the US, and I came from England, I thought that I was going to go into the addictions field. So, and I ended up going, so I have an aunt who lives in Mississippi, and I went and I stayed with her while I applied for jobs anywhere I could go. And then I happened to get a job in Michigan. So I moved to Michigan and I started kind of applying to universities there. And I remember that the first year that I applied, which I believe was 2006 or 2005, 2006. And when I first applied, I got rejections from every place I applied to. So I was like, I didn't leave my family, come on my own. I was pretty young at the time. I didn't come all the way here to hear no's from everybody. So I actually contacted the director of clinical training of one of the universities that I thought I wanted to go to, which I ended up going to at Wayne State, Dr. Mark Lumley. And I asked him, I went and I'm like, listen, I came from the other side of the world to do this. I need to know why I'm getting rejections from every place I apply to. And he was like, oh yeah, I remember your application. And really your major, the major weakness in your application is research. You have no research experience. And I was like, research, what is that? So even though I had graduated, now the situation is different. So I agree with my fellow panelists that the situation now all over the world is a little bit different. But back then, there were no research labs in Lebanon. No, I mean, we didn't know what that something such as a research in psychology meant. Or if they did existed, they were far and few, and very few people knew about them. So, so I'm like, okay, so I need a solution. And he then told me that, oh, we just hired somebody in the addictions field who is going to start in a few months. Contact her. I was working in public health at the time. at the Access Community Center in Dearborn. So I had access to a population of people who were diverse, and I was doing water pipe tobacco prevention work. So I ended up connecting with her. She was amazing, Dr. Emily Grecken. She really kind of took me on, and without her help in the beginning, I couldn't have navigated any of this stuff. So it really boiled down to one person who believed in this random person who came from across the world to seek this degree. And after I had worked with her, she knew about the project I was working on. We published a study together. I reapplied, and then I got in. So interestingly, I reapplied to the other universities that I had applied to before, and I got acceptance from all but one. And that one other institution sent me a letter that said, please don't apply again. Yes. They're like, you are not a good fit for this program. I can't remember the exact wording, but it said, please do not apply again. So if I had any advice, please don't tell people that. You know, especially people who are coming from, you know, across the world, who have taken the time. I mean, applying to clinical programs is a tedious process. So at the very least, show some respect to people's efforts. You can say no and not be mean about it. And you can be encouraging, validating, especially that we're psychologists. I feel that sometimes we forget that there's a human behind all these stacks of paper, and people who are applying from outside the United States probably had to go through a lot more effort than the average person in the US. A lot of people have to navigate multiple systems in order to get to that point. They have to overcome national, domestic, and international obstacles to get to that point. Anyways, but on the other hand, I had people who really believed in me and people who really helped me. My personal experience wasn't an all rosy, you know, skies are blue, birds are singing. I almost dropped out at some point because I didn't know how to navigate basic systems. And again, it boiled down to 3 people who really believed in me and helped me navigate through that. And our director of the clinic, Dr. Barnett, in addition to my mentor and our director of clinical training, they really were key people who saw something in me and said, no, that this person deserves our help. And had it not been for the 3 of them, and of course, first and foremost, my parents. So backtrack, if you want, from before this time. So I had parents who really put education as the top priority. So I had the privilege of having 2 parents who really believed in education, who invested a lot of time and money at the expense of many other things in order to give me a good education. So with that, and then with people who believed in me in that, in that time when I did get to the US, that's really what made all the difference.
Wow, what a story, and such a journey. And it sounds like what you're saying is it's very specific small groups of people that believed in you, gave you the chance, and helped you, that really got you to where you are even today to get through the whole program. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
Yes, and especially we have heard from our panelists how support is super important for international students. And that's why our next question also goes in line with this. I would like to ask Dr. Choi based on your experiences, what recommendations might you have for training programs and the profession at large to better support international students?
Yeah. So I found that the Nebraska Lincoln, the University of Nebraska Lincoln has a wonderful manual for the training, about the training program, the step-by-step manual. So it was very much helpful, especially for international students who were very new to this kind of situation, the system, education system. So that was a A to Z detailed guideline about the details about the coursework and clinical work and something like that. And also, but the legal kind of things and the financial thing, I think that kind of information was missing in the manual. So if the training program might have those kind of detailed guidelines about that, in close consultation with the international affairs might be helpful. So I was back and forth and international affairs and the department administration to figure out what I need to do in preparation for the next visa and, you know, some other legal status, something like that. So that was my kind of recommendation. And I also found very much helpful to have a very diverse exposure to the culture outside the training program and also social interactions and outside the training was very helpful. So as an international student, so for me, it's a kind of very new to this culture and language as a second language. So clinical practice was very much excited, but very much challenging as well. So kind of anxiety provoking kind of things, because one-way meter kind of supervision is a very much, anxiety provoking situation. So when I had a kind of earlier exposure to those kind of interaction with other people, other students, having TAs during my first year, and also very kind of diverse, opportunities to have clinical experiences, at the residential settings and inpatient settings, and along with one-on-one psychotherapy sessions. So those kind of diversity, kind of training, exposure, I found those ones were very helpful in experience. And the last one, I think it's the most important thing is the mentorship, the great mentorship, the advisor. So it's the most important, I think. So I felt like a kind of child who had to learn everything. So I really appreciate my advisor, Dr. Will Spalding, and he's very patient and very much persistent and showing me a lot of trust. So I can learn like a child within a very safe kind of environment, supportive environment. So I think those one was the most important and helpful. Yep.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, mentorship is quite important when you're abroad and everything is new, a new context. I'm an international student myself. I'm from Macedonia and I'm studying in Spain for the last 4 years. Definitely mentorship has been my mentors, my 3 mentors basically are one of the most important persons, of course, in your student days. As you mentioned also, more information on legal procedures, right, in coordination with international affairs would be are very welcome for international students. Thank you so much for those recommendations. Would any of the other panelists maybe like to add any other recommendations on how the programs and the psychology at large can help international students and can give them the support they need? Yes.
Oh, sorry, was someone gonna go? Didn't want to interrupt.
I think Dr. Dina was raised her hand. Maybe she can go first and then Dr. Sonia. Thank you.
So one of the things that I believe is very important for training programs is to look at ways in which, so from the beginning of the journey until the end. So I think there are multiple levels at which students need support. And it's all the way from the recruitment from the point of recruitment and application all through the time until post-graduation. Somebody had mentioned in the chat to the panelists that one of the challenges people have is having the license to practice in order to get the proper supervised training. So for example, the Board of Neuropsychology requires 2 years of supervised training post PhD in order to get licensed, while the university only offers a year OPT for just 1 year. So people get stuck midway through their training between legal issues and what the university is offering and such. So I think people at different levels need different types of support. So very early on, people do need a lot of hand-holding. They need a lot of orientation to what the systems are like. A lot of the countries outside the United States have very different educational systems, very different points of emphasis during study. Some schools are very much into literary arts, and psychology is kind of seen as an arts field. In other countries, it's more sciencey. So there are major differences in systems. And I don't know if we're going to talk about this later, perhaps, but even looking at criteria for what type of student are you going to, I mean, you can't, if you really want the diversity that's offered by international students, and I have experienced this firsthand with so many people from so many different cultures, that having international students in your school or in your program isn't only a good thing for the students themselves, but it's also quite the asset for the training program itself, because it offers different perspectives, it offers different ways of functioning, different experiences. It helps, in my experience, and I know, I really strongly believe that it increases empathy, it increases compassion, and it helps people, look at things in ways that they would never have thought of before. It's like bringing the world to your students. And I think that the criteria for taking on international students can't be the same as the criteria of taking in students who have studied in the United States. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. What are some of the things that are relevant that may not be applicable, like standardized tests, for example? How applicable are those to international students when you use those same standards, for people who have studied in a different system? And is that really indicative of the types of skills that you want in a psychologist? So I think there are so many different angles that need to be considered, and right from the recruitment level, and then during the training, to involve students in decision making, to have regular forums where students can express the changing needs, because the needs 5 years ago might be different from what they are now. People mentioned changes in political systems, changes in just the order of the world. So like, for example, one of the things that I experienced when Mr. Trump was elected president, I was doing my residency at Emory, and our training director, Dr. Nadine Kaslow, is just one of the most diversity advocates on the planet, I think. So a lot of our team was very diverse. And when Mr. Trump was elected, there was a state of panic. We had people from, I don't know, 5, 6 different countries outside the US. And everybody suddenly thought, these are like really smart, very resourceful people who felt like they were going to be kicked out of the country any second. And I remember that we had to close clinics that day, literally. Like, people were shaking, shivering, crying, didn't know. Some of them were DACA children, and they didn't know if that was going to be revoked, if they were going to be deported. I mean, it was a full-blown state of panic. And we had to close clinic, and I and maybe 1 or 2 other people held debriefing sessions for people. They just needed a space to like talk and vent and recoup, and then go back and work with patients, some of whom held those same beliefs that might get them kicked out of the country, or that spoke so much to their fears. So I think it's very important for training programs to kind of keep that. And I don't know that had the training director and the chief psychologist was somebody other than Nadine, I don't know that they would have made the same decision. I don't know that they would have understood that that's something that was really needed, that people needed that space. So I think it's very important for training program to keep those channels of communication open and to address the needs of students and understand that this is an evolving process, that you can't have a set of recommendations that are going to apply for every place and time. So that flexibility, that fluidity, that keeping communication open and truly listening to your students and not thinking like, that you know it all. Because sometimes all of us, despite our best efforts, we forget sometimes that our experience isn't necessarily everyone else's, and that's normal part of human functioning. And just being humble and being aware that even when we mess up and we behave in ways that aren't compatible with the ways that we want, with our values or the ways that we want to run a program, that we apologize and step back and reopen those channels of communication.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dana. Yeah, definitely. Yes, for such an inspiring story. And I do agree that international programs, training programs should have all of these things in mind, all of these values, and really apply them, right, in their practices, especially in communication, and leaving that space for international students to discuss their changing and evolving needs, as you said. Dr. Sonia, would you like to comment also?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say a lot of the same things that Dr. Ayna already spoke to, and just the one thing that I'll add really quick is, I think we have a lot of these conversations, but my question is always, well, what are we doing to address it? And it's great to have this dialogue, but can we what's going to come out of this, right? Can we maybe start a task force of training directors here in the US who are maybe international students themselves and have a passion for this and really want to advocate for international trainees? Because I think a lot of the times too, training directors are working within a system. And I think if the system is not supportive, I mean, I've experienced this myself too, where it's like I'm advocating for this international student hire, but it's like, oh, but then we have to go through the whole visa process. That's expensive. We have to, I've heard these dialogues, and so it's like, I think something needs to be done on a systemic level to address it in order for real change to happen.
Thank you very much.
May I add something?
Yeah.
Oh,
Ayna, yeah, you go ahead.
Just a quick thing, and to follow up on that, I so agree with Dr. Dhallwal that action steps, I think, are very important. And I really would like to piggyback on that and suggest that maybe after this, to have a set of recommendations that we can bring forward. Perhaps we can start with our divisions that are hosting this webinar, and then maybe they can take it on to APA, and then at the larger APA level, perhaps start pushing for those sorts of changes. Yeah, I don't know if it's possible, but if APA can have some communications with NIH about the training funding, the majority of the training funding is for the domestic students. And I found that the VA hospital also has great, training programs and funding, but those are only eligible for, domestic or citizen or, permanent residentship. People with that. So I don't know if we can have some more training funding for international students after the PhD program. So I think that would be very much helpful to secure their legal status and financial status to pursuing some more professional jobs. So I really wanted to stay in the United States after having PhD, and I really love being here and doing some research with wonderful, advisors and colleagues. So, and I was working at the medical center, and the important thing is to get the research funding. So the only research funding I can apply as an international student
for securing my position was the K99 RO kangaroo kind of funding. So, but it's a majority of that is kind of for engineering department or other science STEM area. So it's a kind of tricky to get in there as an international student majoring in clinical psychology. So if we have more research funding opportunities for international scholars, I think it might be very much helpful. So I wanted to add something.
Thank you very much, Kiyoung.
And definitely, I really appreciate the discussion on kind of specific action items that we can collectively take. Right, there's definitely strength in numbers, and among our panelists, for example, who all are such esteemed individuals in the profession and across different countries. And I mean, it looks like as well in the chat box, there's support for individuals who are interested in helping support as well. So I think that would be a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to work together in terms of trying to make and impact change and share resources as well. So I do appreciate that. I recognize this this question initially kind of didn't involve the component of advocacy, but if it's okay with the panelists, definitely wanted to incorporate that as well. For our panelists who return to home countries, what were the advantages and disadvantages of being a psychologist holding a degree from a different country? And how were you able to adapt the education that you received to make it more culturally relevant to where you live? And also, sorry for a third part of the question, but what has advocacy kind of looked like within the realm of the work that you're doing as well? And how has your education maybe helped contribute to that? And so that's just kind of an open question for anyone who might be interested in answering.
I'm happy to go first. So I was smiling as you asked that question, because that is a day-to-day struggle. So I came back to Lebanon in 2019, and I started working August 1st, 2019. And on October 17, 2019, hell broke loose in Lebanon. The revolution started, and then it's been downhill since then. I don't know how familiar people are with what's happening here, but it's been one crisis after another, between the banking system collapsing, the currency devaluation, the collapsing banking system, capital control, COVID, the explosion of the port of Beirut. I mean, it's just been one thing after another. So when I came here, well, first off, the education of having a degree from the US in Lebanon is something that's really looked high upon. So let's start there. So I'm kind of, and I think that's something that's, in my experience, is internationally, if you have a degree from the US, it's looked at with quite a level of high esteem and appreciation. And it does give you an edge over people who have graduated from local universities, for better or for worse. I think that's a double-edged sword. But that aside, having a degree from the US is a prestigious thing in a third world country. So that helped. The question of adaptation, I was very lucky to work with some people who really valued diversity, and that process of how would I translate this and adapt things to a different country started from the first years of training in my doctoral program. So when we were looking at things like working with people from different SES, working with immigrants, working with refugees, well, there weren't so many refugees early on, but later. Working with individuals, I mean, even I studied first in Michigan and then I went to Georgia. It is quite the difference in the type of population, the values. So I think the diversity is something that you train for. It's not something that you do overnight. And it's a process that keeps evolving, just like everything else. So when I moved to Lebanon, I already had that mindset, but despite that, there were quite a few challenges. So number one, most of my education was in English, and I'm privileged enough to work at the AUBMC, where quite a good portion of the population speaks English, but not everybody does. And there are certain concepts that even for English-speaking individuals can't be easily translated or understood. If you speak English, but you've never been to the US, for example, there are ways in which you express yourself that is going to be different. So there needed to be a lot of checking and rechecking and making sure that when I say something, they understand it correctly and vice versa. There's also the translation in my head. And a big challenge for me was using certain tests or assessment tools that for something very specific, for example, like borderline personality disorder or dissociation, a lot of which weren't translated at the time. And apparently I wasn't the only one who's having that frustration. So I was lucky enough to cross paths with colleagues through DBT, through the DBT community, DBT MENA, people in Egypt, Dr. Ahmed Abdel Karim, people in Jordan, Ms. Basma Kilani, who formed DBT MENA. And then when we started working together, we found each other almost. And so now there's been in one of our attendees, Mr. Paul Kaukabani is one of the people who are working on translating these things. So finding people who are like similar-minded people who share that struggle and beginning to consult, finding other people who have been through similar experiences, who understand both cultures, is very important. And then talking with other colleagues about how would you express this particular idea in this culture. Some of the things aren't relevant. I mean, the whole idea isn't relevant. And some of the things that we discuss in the mother tongue language don't even exist in English. So there's a lot of trying to find synthesis, and there's a lot of trying to really understand what can you take from the Western culture and apply it here, and then do that in the circumstance where a lot of the values and priorities, I should say, are changing because of the economic situation, because of the health situation. I mean, even for those of us who didn't have to deal with this international change, having to practice under the pandemic condition is alone like a major challenge. So I think perhaps that may have given people some empathy for the type of struggles that we may have here. And just very briefly on the advocacy piece, one thing that I also noticed is that the US has one of the highest standards for practice in the profession. So even the use of the word clinical psychologist, so outside the US, clinical psychologist means master's degree. In the US, you can't call yourself a clinical psychologist unless you have a doctoral degree plus licensure to practice clinical psychology. So I had to practice a lot of radical acceptance to really grasp that concept and to be okay with it. But pushing for stronger laws, like in Lebanon, the profession didn't even have licensure until 3-4 years ago. So having to practice within settings where there isn't really a system for accountability, licensure doesn't exist, or if there are laws that regulate the profession, they're very limited. There's lots of stigma. So a lot of psychoeducation is needed, a lot of advocacy at the legal level to even regulate what we do, because there are lots of people who claim to be psychologists or therapists who really have no idea what they're doing, and they end up causing a lot of harm unintentionally to people. So advocacy is extremely important to help raise the standard of the profession in a lot of countries outside the US.
Absolutely, and definitely, Dr. Ayna, most grateful for all the wonderful advocacy that you're doing, both within the US and abroad as well. It's just been wonderful to see such amazing work that you've done. So really appreciate that. And I don't know if our other panelists might like to share as well.
I'm happy to share if that's okay. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ayna. I think you've really kind of created a framework for how to respond to this question that is like multi-layered essentially. And I resonate a lot with what you have already shared, so I won't add too much. But I think for me, the advantages of returning back, given the PhD from UMKC, was that I really learned how to be multiculturally aware. And I don't want to say obviously it's not complete, it's ongoing. I mean, it's going to be there as long as I continue to work with people and I continue to be in this field. But yeah, it has given me an advantage to work across cultures, even while living in India. And I agree also with what you shared about that extra edge. I'm able to very easily engage in international collaborations, given that I have a network of people in the US still that I am connected to, and we can kind of work together, and that expands the scope of the work that I can do with this degree. So it's given me a lot of advantages. And in general, from a personal standpoint, you live in a different country for 7 years, your personality changes for sure. You develop in ways, again, that you may not have imagined. And I've definitely developed my personality, as well as just a sense of general like healthy confidence, and being able to navigate different conversations, different communications from different people in Indian society as well. On the other hand, I want to add a bit to the disadvantages, which as I'm thinking about, like, so there were times when I was trying to find my space here and where I can potentially work, and like almost feeling like I could be overqualified, not in a negative way. I mean, I completely appreciate what is being done currently in India, but I do think there were no positions for PhD level practitioners, like places I wanted to work in, say group practices. The highest qualification they wanted was MA psychology or MPhil, because MPhil is also a degree here that actually based on which you can call yourself a clinical psychologist based on government regulations. So given that, and the fact that either there was no clear work outline for me, and if I did get those positions, I'd probably be paid the same amount. So there was just not, I had to create that work, and I had to really navigate what that would mean for me. So thinking out of the box, trying to find alternative means of income, again developing my identity as an independent practitioner, as a psychologist, I think is something I'm still working on, and is in progress. The other thing sometimes I question too is, if I'm working as a practitioner here, how much am I with this degree, how much can I legitimately charge a client in terms of fees? How much is too high or too low, given that I'm comparing myself to master's level practitioners here, masters or MPhil level practitioners here. So those questions are constantly something that I'm navigating, and having to connect with local support networks and psychologists here to find out, okay, what's really going on, and what do I need to learn or relearn, in a sense. So sometimes it can feel isolating, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, when you stand out so much from the crowd that you have no one to kind of rely on or call an ally. So that's been a work in progress, and something I am continuously doing. In terms of the adaptation piece, I learning about local practice guidelines, and the main learning from the multicultural competence training that I got throughout, again, my time in the US, was that there is no one size fits all, and you really have to assess needs, current needs, and what people need before kind of applying what you know. And so that I think this came up in other questions too. This just piece of humility, like not assuming that you know everything. And so adaptation to local needs, for example, clients here, I've noticed need much more structure in therapy that that I'm not used to providing when I was in the US. I think it was a little more free flowing and fluid, because people are already socialized into treatment. So I think that sensitivity is something that I had to develop. Also, the involvement of family is a lot here in India, and it's assumed that family members in some situations will directly be involved with the therapy process, and so that's been a new learning. In India, a lot of people also rely on spirituality rather than going and talking to a mental health professional. Where they find what is causing mental illness, is that question is like, is it outside of me? Is it inside of, is it within me? And so again, there are a lot of those cultural nuances that need to be, I have needed to be sensitive to, which may not have happened unless I had trained outside and, learned all these skills. So I do appreciate my international education in that sense. And the other thing, again, major, important factors that like taking a systemic approach, again, rather than, seeing a person environment interaction, rather than simply kind of, internalized one of those medical models that, again, have kind of dominated the field of mental health. So all of that. And I think, Daniel, to your question on advocacy, I'm nowhere close to that yet. I think I'm still finding my ground here. I know it's been 2 years, but I do think it's an ongoing process. The fact that I'm here, the fact that I'm trying to create therapeutic spaces in whatever capacity I can, even mentoring students, I think I'm trying to do as best as I can. So it's ongoing. So I don't really have a clear answer to that question. But thank you for asking that and bringing that up.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dr. Khanna, as well. I think that what you shared is so important, just that ongoing process. It definitely, it makes a lot of sense, right? That all of this is a continuous ongoing process for continuing to learn adaptation and that component of cultural humility as well. And of course, I'm most grateful for, I know you mentioned haven't started the advocacy yet, but I know you've done a lot of wonderful work as well in the profession. And so really wanting to highlight that and just express the gratitude for that as well.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. Maybe I need to remind myself of that sometimes. Thank you.
And, advocacy isn't just about changing laws, but also when you're mentoring students, when you're talking about this, when you're psychoeducating the community, when you're influencing others, you never know. Maybe one of those students one day might become a legislator and they might make all the difference because of their experience with you. So I think that advocacy is a much bigger umbrella. So I'm sure just by simply you being there, being here, that's advocacy as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Ayna. And Dr. Dhallwal.
Thank you.
And Dr. Choi, would either of you like to add anything before we go into the question and answer segment?
I'll just add one quick thing. Hopefully this is quick, but it was just something I was thinking about. The question for those of you who return home to your home countries, and I also think about, psychologists who are in the US who want to return home to their home countries. But, I think money is always an uncomfortable topic to discuss. Compensation, I think, especially in this field where we're so ingrained to do things for free and offer services pro bono. And, when I think about transitioning back home, I think the reality of it sometimes is that I worry about compensation. I mean, that's just a real thing that I think about. And it's interesting too, to see like the discrimination within the field, because I think back home, if I was a researcher with a PhD who had funding and current research, I would be paid a lot more. In fact, I would be paid thousands more. Oh, how cute. But as someone in the clinical field in training, when I look at jobs back home, it's pretty abysmal what I would be paid. And so I feel like something needs to be done on that end too, to address that discrepancy. Like, I think clinical work is just as important as the research piece, right? And the training of clinical supervision and clinical training. And it's like, well, what is that about where, it's like, that's like a major barrier, I think, for some of us who want to return home and do the work at home, but would just not be compensated well at all. I think that's been also a huge factor in my own decision-making process to return home and do the work there. So just some food for thought. I think that's a real thing to think about reversed.
can I add something?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
When I came back to Korea, so I was working in the United States. I was mainly working with people with serious mental disorder. In South Korea, majority of psychiatric settings are still very much medical model basis. So it's not much, multidisciplinary kind of practice here. So I found it very challenging to find out optimal practice setting here to work with individuals with serious mental disorder as a psychologist. So and also it was very hard to find out the place for my students have training, practical and trainings here. So I have to figure out what I can do with my students for my clinical experiences and competencies and my students' clinical competencies. So what I had to do at the beginning to setting up the clinical trials kind of a research setting, and then within the research we can recruit the participants for our effectiveness, investigating the effectiveness of the psychological services for them. And within that research setting, the students can have more trainings under myself, and I can do some more clinical work there, even though it is not real clinical thing. So I have to kind of figure that out. Was very kind of challenging for me at that time. And also it was very important to find out the collaborators, collaborating psychiatrists and social workers. So it was kind of, so finding out the collaborators and was very helpful. And also those are closely linked to the licensure policy and regulations in South Korea. So I'm working for that now. Daniel might know that. So I'm working that with the Global Psychological Alliance. So we don't have the national license regulations in South Korea for psychologists here. So many unqualified the licensure, not licensure, but the certificates and issues. So the public doesn't know what kind of services is qualified and good for them. So as a kind of in the middle kind of career, I'm devoting some of my time to setting up the licensure regulations, and I'm all working actively with legislation parties and the policymakers and governments. So it's ongoing issue. And I think that is also very important internationally, I think. So sometimes I found that international students working in South Korea, studying in South Korea, they bring here with their insurance, but those insurance cannot cover the services in South Korea. So, and also the Koreans living in other countries, they wanted to get some, the services. So it's a kind of, we have very good mobile-based kind of services and getting more services available, but those services cannot fully, cover to regulate it internationally based on some licensure regulations. So I think we have to work for that internationally in collaboration. So, yep, that's what I want to a little bit add.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. At this time, we will now move into our question and answer portion with questions from the audience. As a reminder, please also feel free to submit questions through this feature as if you have any question left that you would like to ask. So one of the questions that we received was about if you are aware of any legislative efforts to ease the barriers related to visa and research funding, for instance, extending the OPT length or sponsoring, if you have any ideas or suggestions regarding this.
That is a very murky question because I mean, having international students is quite expensive. So it's a matter of balancing this. So how much, so I think it's important for programs and for universities to really think about the value of having international students in their programs, and then think about advocacy in shifting things. Because it all boils, I mean, anytime you have research funding for a particular project, it boils down to a group of people who really believe in that cause, who raise that money, and they say this pot of money is going to go for this cause. So, and I think now the more of us are kind of active, the more aware people are becoming of these things. I think I'm not personally aware of any current scholarships outside. Like sometimes you have from your home countries, you might find sponsors who want to send students from that country to receive an education in the US and then return home and give back for a number of years. So these do exist. They're not plenty, but they do exist. But in terms of doing things from the US, I'm not aware of any. And I think it's about time that we begin to think about those things, either in terms of funding or negotiating at the university levels, some exceptions, maybe, I don't know, special visas that don't cost as, I mean, I don't know, there needs to be some sort of discussion to come up with these issues, but I'm not currently aware of anything.
Thank you, Dr. Dina. Would anyone else like to add something on that regarding this question?
Regarding OPT, I would recommend to communicate with the international affairs as early as possible. So because the required materials are changing, getting consultation as soon as possible is very important, I think. And the research funding wise, I think it would always good to have some network, with scholars nationwide to go to the conference and having, connections and networking, and let them know when you are graduated, when you are seeking for the jobs available. And so I think always having those network was very much helpful to get the right position when I need that. So
thank you. Yes. We also see in the chat that people are responding regarding the OPT license. So perhaps you can get in touch and get more information via the person who is available to contact. We would also like to finish off with another question from the question and answers box. How were you able to obtain a license to practice and employment authorization to work in the United States permanently, being a clinical psychologist or being in clinical psychology?
I don't know, I understand correctly about the question. So the first thing to have, I think it's important to have the permanent residency. So I applied for that, and then they required a lot of publication records and recommendation letters for more than 10 renowned scholars in the United States. So so publications seem to be important, and also getting the permanent residency. And also I think if we can get the research funding, NIH funding, that should help and to get a position. And if we get a position at the university, I think it's much easier to have permanent residency. So the different kind of ways to working as a professional here.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, when I started, my first job was at the University of Missouri's Counseling Center, and I was on an H-1B work visa, and then because that's only valid for a certain amount of time. and then you have to apply for a green card or leave the country, at least as a Malaysian. So when I transitioned over to the academic department, like Dr. Choi was saying, like they were able to sponsor me for a green card. And that also is a very expensive process. So I think it just really depends on the department who is sponsoring you. And Dr. Choi is right. Like I feel like, and they want to know that they're investing in the right thing, and that, you know, so I think what they require, like you have to submit everything you've ever done. And there are all these different hoops that you have to jump through, but that's how I got my green card to be here, and I'm still on that green card. It's typically valid for 10 years, and within that time you can apply for US citizenship. If you don't want to apply for US citizenship, then you just reapply when your green card is up, and there's like a fee attached to that as well. But yeah, I definitely think it's finding a department to sponsor you for a green card that is the trickiest part. And I think in this field, your best bet is going the academic route, because not very many, you know, like counseling centers. I know our counseling center here doesn't do the H-1B sponsorship. We're talking about starting to do that, because I think we're missing out on a lot of really good applicants by not having that. So I definitely think that that's still an issue. And again, it's that clinical versus research. So if you're in the academic and the research route, there's more support for permanent residency versus clinical sometimes. So.
There's
Can I just
also
add
the really
something,
low
Dr.
base rate. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was going to add, and Dr. Dhallwal might be a better person to answer this in terms of licensure. Like every state has their own requirement. And I remember in trying to make a decision whether I'd like to continue living in the US or actually even get my license. I think it was, again, it's there's a lot of money you have to pay to apply for licensure, to take the exam, to navigate what state has what requirement. And I think the postdoc is a fairly, I think a majority of the states would require you, again, and please correct me if I'm wrong, require you to have postdoc hours. So I did a 1-year postdoc just so that one is to kind of buy myself some time to figure out what I want to do once I come back home, but also in case I want to return to the US, then I have those hours and hopefully they're valid if I were to apply for licensure. So I just want to add that piece as well. Yeah.
So to get the licensure hours, you can do it through residency or a postdoc, and also you can do it independently by seeking supervision. And just having a regular job. And that I also want to mention something, that seeking supervision when you're an international student can also be quite expensive. So I know Dr. Khanna, you mentioned, and Dr. Dhallwal mentioned about the money and the expenses. And it's also sometimes when you get specialized, when you want to get specialized supervision and you're working outside the US, but you need supervision from the US, it can be quite expensive. Like on average, supervision runs anywhere between $200 and $300 a session. That's half someone's salary outside the US per month. So these issues can become really, really tricky as well. But in terms of getting the licensure outside the US, somebody had that question as well. It largely depends on the country where you're practicing. Some countries have no requirements for licensure, so anybody can go and practice. Other countries, like for example, in Lebanon, I did have to take the qualification exam, and I have to credit a few people, Dr. Brigitte Khoury, who's actually the past president of APA Division 52. She was one who spearheaded those efforts, and Dr. Leila Dirani. So now we do have, so 4 years ago, there became a requirement to take an exam, the colloquium, they call it here, and then a minimum of 400 hours of supervised practice, which is really, I mean, less than what we get in 1 year practicum in a doctoral degree, but it's a step in the right direction. So it largely depends on the country where you're in. Some countries do require you to have certain hours and exams, and some countries don't.
thank you all so much for your helpful responses, and of course also for your participation in today's webinar. We're most grateful to all of our panelists, and we thank you so much for participating. And of course, for our attendees, we would love to hear from you in the audience about this webinar. So please feel free to provide us with feedback about your experience, about both the content and format of today's discussion. And this will help inform many more collaborations to come in the future. And on behalf of Division 52 and our student committee and our wonderful collaborators, Division 17's International Section and IAP, we would just, again, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your experiences, your stories, your reflections, your recommendations. If it might be okay with our panelists, if you would feel comfortable sharing contact information in the chat box, if that would be okay, in case any attendees have any follow-up questions, if that would be okay. But of course, we thank you all so much again, and we hope everyone has a good morning, afternoon. Dr. Choi, we hope you get some rest. Definitely recognize it's really late there, so we apologize, but we're thankful for you. And Dr. Khanna, I believe it's getting late there as well, so we hope everyone has a good day or a good evening as well. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Great.
And thank
Yeah.
you for the
Thank
interactive
you.
audience.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you for organizing this. It was lovely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.